Hi guys, thanks for tuning in to another Q&A video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum, and today we have 3 pages of questions, all submitted as usual by the excellent folks over on Patreon, whose monthly support really does make this channel happen. So if you'd like to have your own question in the queue for next month's Q&A, check out the account over at patreon.com/ForgottenWeapons. Anyway, without further ado, let's move on to our first question, which is from Larry. Larry says, after dissecting so many diverse weapons, have you ever considered designing the perfect rifle or pistol for the marketplace? Obviously, the thought has crossed my mind, and I've gotten this question in various forms from a lot of people over a long period of time. And ultimately, the answer I come up with is no. And the reason for that is I think we're at this period in like a plateau in firearms development, similar to what existed for a long time with the flintlock. It will take a fundamentally new, some sort of paradigm shift in firearms technology in order to really advance substantially from what we have today. So I think there is still opportunity for incremental changes and improvements, optimizations on the guns that we have today. But if you want to make something that really is fundamentally better, like substantially better in the way that cartridges were better than muzzle loaders and self-loaders were better than single-shot rifles, I think that will require something that is very much more than, a new technology of some sort, new propellant, new projectiles, something new like that. Now, as for designing the perfect rifle or pistol, I think really that's a misnomer. There is no single perfect, ideal rifle or pistol or any other type of weapon, because the quality, the relevance, the perfection of a gun really ultimately depends on what it's being used for. And we've got billions of people on the planet who have thousands of different purposes. What makes a weapon good for the police is not what makes it good for the military, which is not what makes it good for a hunter, which is not what makes it good for a competitive sport shooter. There is no perfect. We can design guns that are optimized to one specific purpose or another, but that one shouldn't confuse that with something being objectively better than everything else, because it always comes down to better for what. Our second question comes from Chronoton. This is a rather lengthy question here. He says, my question concerns dealer sample machine guns. I know that these are guns that for one reason or another cannot be bought by the general public, but only by people with the correct license. For example, a license that says they're in the industry of making machine guns. For those who do, they have access to firearms that would otherwise run afoul of the various restrictions on machine guns. My question, is there much of an industry or market making new machine guns for these individuals? Do people with the ability to make or purchase do anything like, say, make a copy of a gun that exists outside of the US just to say they have a functional version of something that would otherwise be impossible to get a hold of? I'm just curious about that particular ecosystem in general, even if it's unlikely that I'll ever get a chance to interact with it myself. So there are a couple different things that are involved here. So a dealer sample machine gun is basically one that was imported into the US after 1968 or manufactured in the US after 1986. And the original purpose for these was the idea that machine guns after those dates are still legally allowed to be in the hands of police and military forces, and as well as, selling for foreign exports. However, if it's illegal to have new machine guns in the US, there's no way for a company to, say, develop or design or manufacture a new machine gun for export. There's no way for... How is a person supposed to sell a machine gun to a police department if they're not allowed to have it themselves? They need some way to be able to show a police department or a military organization, here's the product, here's what I'd like to sell you, you can test it out, you can try it, we can make these changes, that sort of thing. And so that's the purpose, the original purpose of a dealer sample machine gun, is to facilitate commerce in them. Now, what they get used for today is partly that, and there are a number of other uses that people have recognized and kind of exploited. One of them being machine gun rental ranges. If you have a license to deal in machine guns or to manufacture machine guns, there are 2 separate licenses there, you can own these guns that couldn't be owned by the general public, but there's nothing that prevents the general public from using them on your premises under your control. And that's the basis for a lot of, basically all of the machine gun rental ranges that are out there. What those guys do is, because their guns are going to get just a ton of use, they're going to be beat to death if the range is popular and does a lot of business. So they want to have the cheapest possible guns to use so that they're inexpensive to replace when that becomes necessary. The result is they're always going to use dealer sample guns, guns that can be easily rebuilt or modified or repaired when they have problems. So now, among the people who have these licenses, yes, there are definitely some who get the license largely or partly to build on their own collection. This is something ATF specifically does not allow, but it does slip through the cracks. Certainly, there are people who run legitimate machine gun-based businesses who also have their own personal collections. And if a gun ends up in their personal collection because they have the opportunity to buy a dealer sample where they couldn't maybe, where they maybe wouldn't have access to a transferable example of the same gun, yeah, they're absolutely going to buy it. It's going to go into a private collection, and that's sort of a gray area that's in many ways legal. If it's exploited in the wrong way, it could be seen as illegal. But is there a market for people to make guns specifically for those people? Not a large market, because there aren't a ton of those people, and there isn't a lot of demand for any one particular gun. You will see there are gunsmiths out there who specialize in certain types of firearms who are known amongst machine gun dealers. That, oh yeah, if you get one of these guns that isn't working right, you can send it to this guy and he can get it running and send it back to you. And those people may perhaps do a lot of business with folks who are more interested in personal collections than businesses, but again, we're really getting into some pretty specific niche areas. There's no large-scale industry in making new machine guns for the machine gun dealer, like, personal collection sphere. Hopefully I covered that sort of decently. Next question, we actually have two questions from Joseph. First one is, I recently discovered a number of interesting Colt pistols with shoulder stocks and additional furniture to create a pistol carbine, such as the Monarch Rifleette, Colt 1911. Which pistol carbine conversions have you shot, and which is your favorite in concept and or practice? So I haven't shot very many like full-on carbine conversions, like the Mech-Tech carbines. What I have shot a number of are pistols with shoulder stocks. Prior to the National Firearms Act of 1934, there was no restriction on this sort of thing, and even afterwards, a lot of these guns, a lot of the early versions of these guns, have been exempted from NFA regulation, and so they are available out there. They're legal without having to get tax stamps. I own one myself, and that is a Chinese contract, or a Canadian-made Chinese contract Browning high power with a shoulder stock made by Inglis. I've also shot Lugers with shoulder stocks. I've shot broom-handle Mausers with shoulder stocks. What else? Astra. A number of the other pistols with stocks. And many of the ones that I haven't had a chance to shoot, I have had a chance to handle. And to be honest, they all kind of suffer from the same problem, and that is the stocks are never all that good. The ones that double as holsters, like the Browning high powers, tend to be, or at least they may not be fragile, but they really feel fragile. They have kind of a weird shape to them because they have to be large enough to hold the entire pistol as well as double as a shoulder stock. In addition, the locking lugs where the shoulder stocks attach pretty much always seem to be a bit loose. And so you get this kind of weird feeling of the gun kind of wibble wobbles a bit at the joint between the stock and the grip, which is a little disconcerting. Some of the other guns have solid stocks, like the Lugers, and early Browning high powers have solid board stocks. Those suffer from some of the opposite problems. They tend to be extremely thin. We're talking a third of an inch wide, 7, 8, maybe 10 millimeters wide. And they're still a little bit rattly on the guns. You don't really have to worry about breaking them, but you don't get nearly as good of a cheek weld for actually shooting with them. Some of the others really do have more substantial problems. There are some that are leather holsters with wire reinforcement and wire bars that go out to connect to the stock. A lot of that stuff seems really kind of questionable for practical use. As far as which is my favorite? Well, the Browning High Power is certainly the most accessible of them. It's one of the few that's available relatively inexpensively. I mean, it's still an expensive gun, but compared to finding some of the others, it's more accessible. I found none of them are all that pleasant to shoot as pistols with shoulder stocks, though. So maybe one of these days I will find something a little more modern that is. I should point out, when these are machine pistols, like Mauser Schnellfeuers, the stocks definitely help. Those same objections come into play, but when you have the capacity of full auto coming out of them and being able to control that with a shoulder stock, that makes them to me more valuable than just standard semi-automatic pistols with stocks. Joseph's second question is, I have done some reading on the pattern 1914 and the model 1917 U.S. Enfield rifles, and have seen conflicting information on the appropriate nomenclature. So, we actually have a model of 1917 right here. Fantastic rifle, by the way. Best bolt-action rifle of the First World War. Now, there are two versions of that rifle. There's the British one in .303, and there's the American one in .30-06. And the British one is the P14. That stands for Pattern 14, or Pattern 1914. The previous gun, the original rifle designed in this pattern was the model of 1913, the P13, the Pattern 1913, which was in a 27 or a 276 caliber cartridge. When World War I broke out, they decided to scrap the new cartridge idea and just built it in .303 British. It was the then designated the 1914 Pattern 1914, or P14. The U.S. then also adapted that rifle, converted it over to .30-06, and started building it. The technical nomenclature for the U.S. military for that rifle is the Rifle Caliber 30 Rifle. Let's see, what is it? Rifle U.S. Caliber 30 model of 1917. So technically Enfield isn't in there anywhere. Technically P isn't in there anywhere. P is for pattern, which is a British designation term only. The U.S. uses M. It's the model of 1917. That said, even on some of the official documentation, this is referred to as an Enfield rifle by the U.S. It's the M1917 Enfield, where we also had the M1903 Springfield. So using Enfield as the designation is perfectly appropriate. However, it should be P14 and M1917. All right, next question is from Charles. It says, Ian, in your videos you cover some interesting explanation on how military and police manual of arms dictated certain features at certain times, like magazine cutoffs and volley sights. In your opinion, which notable manuals of arms in modern small arms history were ahead of their time and which were suffered long past when they should have been removed? Well, I would say actually one of the ones that was ahead of its time and wasn't really fully, the benefits weren't fully recognized for a long while, is the detachable box magazine. So even some of the very early Remington, like the Remington Lee rifles, had detachable box magazines and were actually issued with spare magazines. Those early guns in 45-70 didn't have stripper clips. They just had detachable magazines. And I think there was a lot of benefit to be gained from that. When these rifles went into service, you typically saw them like the British SMLE, they still had a detachable magazine, but they were issued with stripper clips instead of extra magazines. Same thing would hold true for the Swiss Schmidt-Rubin rifles and the K31s. They had a detachable magazine, but you only got one. One thing the Germans would find during World War II, or during World War I, they experimented a bit with extended magazines, as did the US. And they found that giving the rifle like a 20-round extended box magazine and loaded with stripper clips really actually didn't do all that much to improve the rate of fire of the weapon. For one thing, it was still bolt action, but more importantly, what you were doing is simply taking the long time it took to use stripper clips and just stacking a bunch of those together. So you wouldn't have to reload for another 20 rounds, but when you did, you had to stuff 4 clips into that rifle instead of 1, and the time always balanced out. By the end of the war, they were actually experimenting with, or had formally adopted or accepted for manufacture, although they never actually got them, a new model of the Mauser 98 that actually used a detachable 10-round box magazine. And had that been issued with a couple of spare magazines, it would have done something to increase the rate of fire of these rifles. They still would have been bolt action, but at least they wouldn't have been dealing with stripper clips, which really were a problematic feature. So had people recognized that and acted on it earlier, that probably would have been beneficial. One of the features that was experimented with, perhaps more than it should have been, is the progressive trigger in a select fire weapon. Usually you see these in submachine guns, where the idea is instead of having a switch or a button or something to switch from semi-auto to full auto, you have a trigger where if you pull it just a little bit, it fires semi-auto, and if you pull it farther, it fires full auto. The Steyr AUG does this, the Bergman MP35 does this, and a number of other guns. The problem is that system just never really works all that well in real life. It means you have kind of a crummy trigger pull usually, and when people are under stress, they tend to just gank on the trigger and fire bursts when maybe they would have been better off or intending to fire single shots. Those trigger mechanisms, I think, stayed around a lot longer than they were than was justified. Next up is from David. The CMP reports that they should be getting soon as many as 10,000 Colt 1911 and 1911 A1 pistols that they will eventually sell on the open market. Seeing as these will all be 1912 to 1945 production firearms, what, if any, actual historical value will they have? Will the vast majority be pistols that sat in storage for 50 years? Or will many, or some, or most of them have seen combat? Is there a way to find out the lineage of these firearms once a private person has bought one? So, a number of things to touch on here. Yes, the CMP is actually getting 1911s. It will probably be at least another year before they show up on the market. There's a whole bureaucratic legislative process that they have to go through. The beginnings of it have been completed. They are in the pipeline. A lot of people, I think, have a misunderstanding of what the CMP's mission is. The CMP does not exist to be a cheap source of firearms for the public. The CMP exists to promote marksmanship and competition. And so when the CMP gets guns to sell, the purpose of doing that is not to supply people with the guns, it's to use the money to promote CMP's agenda and programs. So when these 1911s come on the market, they're not going to be dirt cheap. They're probably going to be fairly painfully expensive, and that's deliberate. CMP knows that people are going to buy them, and they're going to price them not at a point that they'll sit around forever, but they're going to price them to get the most out of them that they can. Now, will they have historical value? Yeah, absolutely. I can't tell you exactly what, and until we know exactly which guns are being surplus through CMP, there's really no way to know exactly what typical lineage to expect. But these are guns that have been in U.S. inventory for a long time, and I'm sure a substantial number of them do have combat provenance to them. Now, as for finding out more information, there is a resource for that. It is the Springfield Research Service. This is Volume 1, Serial Numbers of U.S. Martial Firearms, and it has a number of pages specifically on 1911 and 1911 A1 pistols. So if I flip here, page 90 in this is automatic pistols. We have the serial numbers allocated to different manufacturers, which is not quite what you're looking for. But here, page 93, 94, and 95 include a substantial number of pistols listed by serial number that were shipped to specific places. A lot of guns that went to Nicaragua, some for various National Guards, some to the Marine Corps. So yeah, some of that information is out there. Not necessarily on every pistol, but there will be a possibility. Next question is from Q. It says, I'm personally not a huge fan of the AR M16 platform for my own personal reasons. Do you think that any weapon other than the AK platform could have, in the past, if introduced earlier, taken the popularity that the AR-15 earned? Is there any weapons platform today that you think can give the AR-15 or M16 a run for its money? So, two-part question. First off, is there anything better than the AR or M16? I think no. Largely because of the time that has gone into improving and iterating that rifle. I think it's possible almost anything that has been in service for that long, we're talking 50 plus years now, will have gotten to the point that any new gun will be very hard pressed to compete effectively without having had the advantage of 50 years of tinkering and improving. Now, what gun in particular would have been well suited to do that instead of the AR-15? Well, I think the AR-18 is a pretty good contender. The AR-18 gave us, it took the bolt from the AR-15, which is definitely one of the gun's strong suits, and then it matched that with the gas system from the Tokarev and the G43, which is a fantastic gas system. The AR-18 has gone on to be the basis for probably more modern combat rifles than any other firearm. The G36 is based on it. The Mexican FX-05 is based on it. The Japanese combat rifle is based on it. What else? Basically, every one of those rotating bolt, multiple locking lug, rotating bolt, short gas piston systems, most of those are based on the AR-18. So, had we adopted the 18 back in the 1950s or 60s and given it the same developmental boost that the AR-15 got, yes, I think it definitely could have been every bit as good. But we didn't, so you'll never know. From Jevidar says, because of the different knowledge levels and time interest, something I might consider forgotten might be a common knowledge item to you. My question is, what criteria do you use to consider something a forgotten weapon? Well, I'm going to have a bit of a cop-out here in that I don't really have a definition for a forgotten weapon. I originally built the site and the video channel to document things that weren't being documented elsewhere, but I have started to expand that a bit over the last couple of years, and typically what I'm looking for are guns that are either relatively unknown or relatively mechanically interesting or relatively influential. So you've probably seen that we've covered a number of guns, like for example the PKM, that are in no way forgotten or obsolete or out of the general public gun interest. However, they're guns that are very influential and extremely good examples of firearms manufacturing and design. So I think it's as important to cover those as it is to cover the ones that are truly and objectively forgotten. Usually, if a gun is completely forgotten, it's for good reason. There are only a very few that got overlooked for unfair reasons. Most of the time, if it's gone, it's because it, well, sucked for some reason. So, going forward, continuing forward, yes, you will see more guns that are not completely forgotten, as well as ones that really run the gamut from lesser known to really quite obscure to, wow, this was buried in the back of a museum somewhere and nobody even knows what it is. In fact, we have a couple of those coming probably next month in January. Next up is from Ian, excellent name. Can you answer why the Japanese switched from 6.5 by 50 to 7.7 by 58 in the middle of a war? Isn't the logistical mountain of supplying troops with a new rifle and rifle round enough to overcome the supposed shortcomings of the 6.5? Well, that is obviously the one side of the equation, and I would say clearly the Japanese thought otherwise. However, it's useful to point out that the Japanese adopted a 7.7, actually a semi-rimmed 7.7 millimeter cartridge in 1932 for machine gun usage. So when they went to the 7.7 by 58 rifles in 1939, it wasn't a completely new thing. They did already have multiple cartridges in the logistics train, and 7.7 was one of them. Now, the semi-rimmed and the rimless versions of 7.7 are not strictly interchangeable, but the other thing to consider is that this was sort of in the middle of a war, but it's also sort of in the middle of an occupation. In 1939, Japan was at war with China, and really nobody else, and they weren't having all that much difficulty fighting the Chinese. I mean, it wasn't a cakewalk, but it wasn't like the Japanese were about to encounter with the United States. So did they know in 1939 that they were going to be adding a much larger second front to their war in 1941? No, they really didn't. So that didn't come into play. Although from our perspective, we would often think of it as, they're about to start fighting the Americans. Why would they make things more difficult for themselves right then? And there are there's more to the cartridge, the bullet question, than just, say, terminal ballistics. 6.5 is in many ways a better bullet diameter than 7.7. It's going to have better long-range performance generally, as long as the bullets are designed for that. However, there are some military applications where it's not better. For example, payload. if you want to have tracers or explosive rounds or armor-piercing rounds or incendiaries, all of those things require volume in the bullet, and a bigger bullet is better suited to that than a smaller one. And that's part of the reason why you see a lot of militaries during this time shifting away from 6.5. You also have to consider the use in machine guns as well as rifles. The machine guns have an accurate effective range that is substantially longer than rifles, and a lot of militaries wanted to have more energy on target out at those ranges with machine guns. And finally, just because we recognize what is better terminal ballistics today doesn't necessarily mean that they did so in the past. Often militaries would judge the effectiveness of a projectile by things like raw kinetic energy. How many foot-pounds of energy does it have at 1,000 meters? And they weren't necessarily considering factors like sectional density or what the trajectory was over those ranges or its susceptibility to wind. So all of these things come into play, and also remember that the people who make decisions for the military are usually right, but not always right. So there's nothing to say that sometimes they don't make decisions that are, in fact, wrong and unwise. James asks, why were side-mounted magazines so popular in early submachine guns? Was it a reliability issue, or was it just because Schmeisser designed it first and everyone copied that layout? Well, copying the existing layout is certainly one thing that does play a part. However, there are also some genuine rationales for a side-mounted magazine. So if we look at it in general, you can have it on the top, the side, or the bottom. And there are pros and cons to all three of these. If you put it on the top, you're going to have the best improved reliability, just gravity aiding the feeding of the magazine. However, you have a magazine sticking up in the middle of the gun, and so you have to offset your sights around that. If you have the magazine on the bottom, you're going to have the least gravity assistance, or the most gravity interference with feeding, which, let's be honest, is usually not that big of an issue. I don't think that's the primary consideration here. However, if you want to have a reasonably long magazine, 30-some rounds, that's going to be a fairly long, physically long magazine, and it's going to make it difficult to go prone with the rifle, or with the submachine gun. Remember that rifles at this time generally had flush-mounted magazines, and you could get really low to the ground with a rifle. And I think there are a lot of soldiers whose combat experience dictated that getting really low to the ground was a really good idea. That's a pretty good survival instinct, and it's a very real thing. If you're close enough to the ground that you can't be seen, or that you're actually below cover, you're a lot safer. So I think that was probably the primary incentive for side-mounted magazines, was to allow someone to have the gun and get as low as they could with a rifle. There are potentially some additional benefits to side-mounted magazines. They can be less clumsy in some circumstances. The guys who are designing the Sterling submachine gun really thought that, for example, British Special Forces would have been better off with Sterling with a side-mounted magazine than MP5s with a bottom-mounted magazine that tended to get hooked up in slings. How significant are those claims? Maybe there's a little bit of validity there, but largely I think the side-mounted magazine was so that you can get nice low prone with that gun. Next up from Julio, do you think that some gunmaker could stage a comeback for the 7.62 Tokarev along the lines of plus P 9mm ammo? Beretta used to make a 7.65 Parabellum of the 92 for the Italian market. It should not be a stretch to have used the Tokarev round. No, I don't think the 7.62 Tokarev will ever make a comeback. The problem there is the 9mm just has such widespread acceptance that people are very happy with it. What does the Tokarev do better than 9 Parabellum? Well, there are arguments out there that it has better penetration, has better sectional density, perhaps it's higher velocity. The question is, are any of these things important enough, and does the Tokarev do them better enough than the 9 Parabellum to warrant switching over a lot of different infrastructure? Just looking at magazines and spare parts and armorers and ammunition production itself, there's a lot of cost to changing over from one cartridge to another. And even if the new cartridge is slightly better, it has to be better enough to justify all the expense of the changeover. It's also worth pointing out that the 7.62 by 25 is substantially longer than 9 Parabellum. Long enough that you can't just, for example, keep the frame of a pistol in Parabellum and scale it up or rechamber it for 7.62 Tokarev. There's just not enough space. You can do it the opposite way. In fact, if you notice, guns like the Tokarev that have been chambered for 9mm Parabellum typically have magazine blocks in them, because otherwise the 9 Parabellum cartridge is too short for reliable feeding. It kind of rattles around and gets out of whack. So in theory, it's always possible that 9 could be replaced by some other cartridge, but I think that's much more likely to happen with a cartridge that can be more readily adapted to the existing guns and magazines. And at the same time, if you find a cartridge that's close enough that it can do that, it's probably not going to offer all that much improvement over 9x19. Next up is from Ben. It says, thoughts on the original CETME ammunition, i.e. the extremely long and light 7.92 caliber projectile, and any places to find more information on it, such as projectile construction, barrel twist, testing data, etc. The biggest source of information I could find was the World's Assault Rifles by Gary Paul Johnson, and that seems to have nothing, and there seems to be nothing online that I could find besides what's in that book. Yes, there is an excellent source of information on the 7.92, that is, by the way, 7.92 by 41 millimeter. And that source is the collector grade book Full Circle, which is all about roller locking. The 7.92 by 41 CETME came out of developments that started at Mauser and then went to CETME in Spain in the late 1940s and very early 1950s. And there's a fair amount of information in here, a couple pages at least, discussing the development and testing and construction and everything that you're looking at there. Now, I can go over the basics. I strongly recommend you get a copy of the book if you're interested in this sort of thing in any level of detail, because that book is chock full of information, and I guarantee you that when it finally sells out, they're not reprinting that thing, because it is a very niche book. That said, 7.92 by 41 CETME came about because the requirement that the Spanish government insisted the CETME be able to be reliably fired in full auto out to 1,000 meters distance. In fact, I believe what they wanted was like a 50% hit probability on a man-sized target with a burst of a full auto burst at 1,000 meters. This is kind of an insane requirement, and it's really impressive that the engineers came up with a solution that actually met it. And their solution was this cartridge. So what they realized is the thing that was really going to prohibit this from being a reality, a controllable full power rifle in full auto, was recoil impulse. So they started with a very strict limit on how much recoil impulse they would be willing to tolerate, and then looked at what they had to do to make a cartridge with low recoil that could actually shoot out to 1,000 meters with some reasonable accuracy. And so what they needed for that was excellent exterior ballistics, a very good BC. They did that by making the bullet really long. It's like 44 millimeters long, the projectile. It's huge. It's almost as long as the case. In fact, I think it's actually longer than the case, although when you actually assemble it into a cartridge, it's not. Anyway, I digress. And then for construction, they made that bullet primarily out of solid aluminum with just a short section of copper driving band on it in order to balance the longitudinal and the axial weight distribution of the bullet. The book gets into a little more detail on this. Basically, they came out with, I think it was a 106 grain bullet that had not a whole lot more muzzle energy than the 8mm Kurtz, but was in fact capable of controllable full auto fire from the shoulder, and you could actually shoot it out to 1,000 meters. Now, can anyone reliably see the target and hit it at 1,000? No, but when they clamped the rifle in a rest, it was feasible. It did what it was required to based on the government dicta. So that cartridge lasted up until the adoption of 7.62 NATO, when CETME went to propose this rifle and ammunition combination for NATO trials. The first thing they did was they discovered, the U.S. is insisting on 7.62, but at that point they didn't actually have a full cartridge specified, just the diameter. So they necked this thing down to 7.62 by 41 millimeter. And then, that was kind of short-lived. Turns out the U.S. was insisting on 7.62 by 51. So for a short time, they actually made a cartridge that was 7.62 by 51 with this very long bullet. That lasted a very short period of time. And then the one that has probably caused the most confusion in small arms circles is the later 7.62 CETME. The idea there was they finally went, okay, well, I guess we'll throw this whole concept out the window and we'll adopt 7.62 by 51 with a traditional lead bullet. However, at that point, they were trying to use that back in this same rifle that had been designed for a very light bullet. And the recoil characteristic, the action of the weapon wasn't capable of handling the recoil of 7.62 by 51 NATO. So in that early model of CETME, they used a reduced powder charge so that the gun wouldn't beat itself up too much. That eventually was scrapped, and Spain adopted the 7.62 by 51 standard NATO cartridge. So again, the book for this is Full Circle by R. Blake Stevens, published by Collector Grade, and I will have a link to it in the description below because it's an excellent book on a very nerdy subject. Next up is a question from Sven, who says, what weapon was the biggest disappointment when you actually got to shoot it? Ever suffered any injuries beyond stubbed fingers, etc. while working on the show? Well, I do have a piece of brass cartridge case still stuck in my chest. That's an interesting incident which Carl and I detailed on an episode of In Range TV entitled Dangerous Things Are Dangerous. If you're interested in that story, I'll have a link to that in the description text as well. As for guns being a big disappointment, interestingly, there are two, and they are both derivatives of the Johnson. One of them is the Israeli Dror light machine gun. Now, what I shot was a semi-auto build of a Dror, so I hold out a slim possibility that the real item may not be disappointing in the way the semi-auto was. The other is the Johnson 1941 light machine gun. If you've ever handled one of these things with the pistol grip and the handguard and the lightweight, this seems like a fantastic gun. Balance is a little weird with a very long 25-round single stack mag sticking out the side, but overall you look at this thing and you're like, wow, this had to be just fantastically better than the BAR. And then you go to shoot it and you understand why the Johnson 1941 light machine gun never really took off. That thing is really difficult to shoot. It has far more recoil impulse into the shooter than I would think it ought to. I'm not the only one to have noticed this. I've discussed this gun with a couple other people who've shot them and found that pretty much everyone shares this opinion. Everyone went in going, wow, this gun's awesome. It feels great. It handles great. And it's rare. It must be super cool. And then they shoot it and they go, ugh, yeah, we'll just put that back over there. You know, the thing's a beast to shoot. It just kicks the snot out of you. It's difficult to hold on target and really quite uncomfortable. So, sorry, Johnson, that's why your machine gun didn't take off, is the ergonomic factors just weren't there when it came to actually shooting. So those were used by a few little groups of U.S. Special Forces sorts of guys, First Special Service Force and some others, but never adopted in large scale by the U.S. military. Now the Dror is basically the same thing. It's an Israeli copy of the Johnson 1941 machine gun made in the late 1940s. A few slight changes. The mechanics are basically the same. The bolt and operating mechanism are the same, but it uses a bottom-mounted magazine. They're actually modified BAR magazines, and it's chambered for 8mm Mauser in this case. They did make an early version in .303 Brit, but the ones that actually made it into production were in 8 Mauser. And interestingly, the Israelis had a similar opinion of the gun because they were so excited about it as a domestic production gun in the late 1940s that they actually ordered production to begin in mass production before they'd finished doing all the testing. And then they found in testing that the gun was actually seriously inferior to even surplus guns, Bren guns and MG34s. So my understanding is they ended up using them in training but not in combat. And yeah, the same problem exists with the Dror as with the Johnson. It just beats the snot out of you to shoot. The thing actually has a ridged or a serrated butt plate so that it doesn't slide. And the day after I'd been out shooting it, I had a series of red indentations in my shoulder from that butt plate. Just an unpleasant gun to shoot. Far out of character for what its cartridge and weight and design should have given it. Our next question is from Kevin. It says, you frequently post videos from both Rock Island and the James Julia auction houses. What are the major differences between the two? Do they specialize in different guns? Does one have a larger selection, etc., etc.? So there are a few differences. The one that a lot of people will note right off the bat is that Rock Island does a lot more auctions. Rock Island does, I believe, 5 proper auctions and then a couple online-only auctions each year. Rock Island is an auction house exclusively for firearms. James Julia is an auction house that has a firearms division. So they do 2 firearms auctions a year, and then they also do some other types of auctions. They do art, they do furniture, they do Americana. To be honest, I haven't really ever paid a whole lot of attention to their other divisions. Glassware, they do lamps and glass. So a lot of that sort of thing. So they are a wider range business that has a separate firearms division. And then within that specific firearms division, Julia tends to focus on only really quite high-end guns. So their specialty, I don't think they'll even, generally for their standard auction, they don't even accept guns that are worth less than about $5,000. Now they've added what they call sporting and collectibles, which is a little bit of a lower end, under $5,000 per gun. They've added some of that, but in general, they are doing very high-end firearms. So they're focusing on machine guns, really good antique collectibles, and a lot of high-end sporting guns, sporting shotguns, sporting rifles, that sort of thing. You'll notice when I do videos from there, they often tend to focus on like machine guns and Civil War guns, and that's why. That's kind of what that auction house looks for in particular. And of course, I'm not particularly, personally, all that interested in the sporting guns, so I don't generally cover those. Rock Island, on the other hand, has they do the whole scale. So their online-only auctions are really cheap stuff, often stuff that's cheap for a reason. And then they have, the step up from that are their regional auctions, which I believe they have 2 of per year, if I'm remembering correctly. And those were originally put together primarily for dealers. In those auctions, they batch guns together typically, so that they can do, say the whole batch is, consists of guns that are worth $300, $400, $500 a piece, but they'll put 4 or 5 or 6 of those together as a single lot so that they can sell them for a lot price of a couple $1,000s, which is what they need to do in order to make the sale practical and cost effective for them. Their regionals have like 9,000-10,000 guns each in the auctions, and if they were to try and auction every individual gun independently, it would take weeks and they never get it done. So they batch stuff together so that it goes more quickly and more efficiently. And then Rock Island has a premier auction 3 times a year, which is more like on par with what Julia does. Those are more expensive guns, more valuable, more collectible stuff, or more high-end collectible, I should say. And in Rock Island's premieres, they occasionally will batch like 2 guns together, or maybe 3, but the vast majority are individual guns for sale by themselves. So that pretty well covers the differences, I think. Rock Island is trying to break into the machine gun market that has been pretty much dominated by Julia in the past. Time will tell how that whole process works out. Next up is Campbell, who asks, what was the first gun you ever bought? And the answer for that is a Marlin Model 60. It's a little semi-auto 22 rifle. I strongly recommend 22 caliber rifles in particular for first guns for people. They are cheap to shoot, they're easy to shoot, they don't have a lot of recoil. You need to use hearing protection, but they don't have a lot of blast or concussion. So they're very nice for new shooters to get used to all of the important aspects of shooting, the fundamentals, sights, trigger, breathing, without being distracted by lots of recoil going on. So I actually don't have that Marlin anymore. I have some other 22s, but not that one. But I do not regret that purchase a bit. It was a great choice. Next up is Adam. Says, the Sterling submachine gun used a double feed roller magazine that was lauded for its design. Why did it not catch on for other weapon systems? You are correct. The Sterling submachine gun magazine is an excellent magazine, generally regarded as one of the best of its type. It is a double feed magazine, meaning that it presents cartridges on the left and the right intermittently. That makes it a pretty easy gun to load. It reduces friction in the magazine itself. It has those rollers on the follower. It's an awesome magazine. It is in fact so good that is really better than it needs to be. And that is why nobody else really copied that design, is you just didn't need to. The rollers are a bit superfluous, and if you don't need to spend the extra money on it, well, submachine guns are pretty much always economy type weapons, so if you can cut some costs there, so much the better. Next up is James, who says, "Hi Ian, I was wondering if you could talk about some of the cartridge conversions of the 1870s. Were they uniform, reliable, and widespread? When did they fall out of favor?" Well, they were fairly widespread. They were not really uniform, and they fell out of favor basically when new production cartridge firing revolvers became easy enough to get a hold of that you didn't need to bother trying to convert an old gun. So some of the conversions stuck around for a very long time. There were some people who were very happy with their conversions and kept them and never got rid of them. On the commercial market, as new production guns, they only were really there for a couple of years. And they existed in this period where the raw and white patent was still in force, so companies like Colt couldn't manufacture new cartridge firing revolvers effectively. So they would continue, they could market some of the various types of conversions, but then 1873, as soon as that raw and white patent had expired, everyone jumped to start making cartridge firing guns like Colt, and they stopped marketing on the new market the conversions. So I mentioned they were not uniform. There were a lot of different cartridges during this time period that people would use. You had various different bore diameters that were holdovers from the muzzleloading era. So you had 32s, a 32 caliber cartridge for a 31 caliber muzzleloader. You had 36 and 35s, 38s. I'll do a whole video at some point on cartridge nomenclature to explain why that came about. And then 44s and 45s. Every manufacturer typically had their own proprietary cartridge, not because they were stupid and couldn't get on board with a standard, but rather because there was no standard at that point. This was all brand new stuff. So you had Colt cartridges, you had Smith & Wesson cartridges, you had Merwin and Hulbert cartridges, and a variety of others. And that was probably one of the things that really did lead to the quick downfall of the conversions, is the benefit of, well, the danger of cartridges is, what if you can't get them wherever you happen to be? Muzzle loaders, you can pretty much always, for one thing, the bore diameters were pretty standardized, but even if they weren't, all you had to do was carry a lead mold, and you could pretty much make your own projectiles anytime you wanted. If you can't always get cartridges, that kind of ruins the practicality of a cartridge firing revolver. So once the new production revolvers were going out in force, people did standardize on a somewhat smaller number of cartridges, and the really popular ones took over. So some of the conversions that could use those popular cartridges would have stuck around a little longer, but typically you're looking at the early 1870s was the heyday of the cartridge conversion. Next question is from Alex. It says, "Ian, a long while ago, you posted some videos showing you in the process of building your bunker house and setting up systems to live off the grid. Would you ever consider doing a video or a series of videos about the challenges you faced in getting your place up and running, and generally the lifestyle of living off the grid?" I did do that a while ago. I don't have any plans to continue it in the future, simply because I don't have the time to try and delve into an entire second set of subject matter things about living off grid. If you've seen that video, that house still exists. I still have it. I do not live there full time. As I got more and more busy doing Forgotten Weapons, it just wasn't a feasible place to live. So I live in a more populated area now, where I have better access to things like electricity and good internet access, which are necessary for what I'm doing. Also, access to airports, because I do travel quite a bit these days. So eventually I will finish that house out, and I do very much enjoy a lot of the skills involved in off-grid living. There are some things about it that are great. There are some things about it that really do suck, that people should be aware of. Once you've done it, it's very interesting to read the theory as written by people who have not done it, and see some of the things that are proposed that are maybe good in practice and maybe absolutely terrible in practice, despite sounding good on paper. So unfortunately, I will have to refer you to other channels and other people for off-grid information for the time being. Next up, we have a whole mess of questions from Lars. We will start with number 1. Start with the easy question. The Forgotten Weapon logo, what is it based on? And the answer is it's actually based on nothing. We're just looking for a logo that combined the element of time with a firearm. A lot of people have also asked, what does it mean that it said the clock is at 9 o'clock? That means nothing. It was just the where the hands could show up that kind of looked good with the rest of the logo. Number 2, a question regarding your content. I understand that Forgotten Weapons might not be able to diversify your content that much, but for those of us not living in the US, it would be interesting to see more of what you might think is not all that forgotten, obscure, strange, etc. So weapons that might be common in the US, but are more unknown in the rest of the world. That's a good point. I will take that under advisement, and we'll see what we end up with going forward. Number 3, now for a tricky financial question. Besides supporting you at Patreon, by buying swag from the web store, and by watching and spreading your videos, is there any other way that we, the viewers, can support the channel? Any plans to affiliate links to books that you're referring to? How do the algorithms work at Full30? Is there anything we viewers can do to trigger videos so you get more out of the views? Or anything that viewers shouldn't do? Blah, 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 blah. All right. Well, he pretty much nailed all the big stuff. The biggest thing you can do is watch and share the content with friends who also you think would appreciate it. Patreon is definitely the biggest single source of support for the channel. It is, I would not be still doing this without Patreon, so a huge thank you to all of you guys. As for watching on Full30 or YouTube, Full30 still exists. It does pay better per view, but it is in an infinitesimally smaller group of people than YouTube. I would say absolutely watch it wherever is most convenient for you, and I will adapt to that. I would rather see more people watching and in more depth than trying to steer people to a specific channel or outlet. As for book affiliate links, I do have an Amazon affiliate program, and I do use that whenever I post links to books. So if you are buying stuff on Amazon and you do it through one of those book links, that does help me. It's not a huge source of income, but hey, every little bit does help, and buying through Amazon in that way doesn't cost anything to you, the buyer. So I think that's pretty much it. All right, and he says, we'll end with an easy question. Do I still have my FAL? If yes, have I mounted a Trilux on it? Yes, I still have a FAL. I used to have one, and I traded it for a different one. I do not currently have a Trilux mounted on it because the Trilux is kind of an old, crappy optic. What I actually found for it is a top cover mount with STANAG scope mounting points. So I'm still kind of looking for a STANAG compatible scope to put on there, because I think that'll be more practical than the Trilux. Certainly more easily zeroable. When I tried to zero that Trilux, I had just a horrible time with it. Never did manage to get it properly zeroed, and to this day, I'm not sure if I'm incompetent or if there was something actually wrong with that scope. I still have the scope because it sure looks cool and it's neat to have as an example, but I'm not exactly jumping at the chance to go try and zero it again and shoot with it. Next question is from Tom. It says, are constant recoil systems less effective in locked breech firearms, apart from maybe from long recoil, since a lot of the recoil would be transmitted through the action when the action is locked? Tom, I think you have a bit of a misunderstanding of constant recoil. Virtually all constant recoil firearms, not that there are a lot of them, are locked breech actions. You don't actually see recoil really transmitted to the shooter while the action is locked. Generally, and you'll see this if you watch a bunch of the slow motion in the various videos I have up, usually the point where recoil energy is transmitted to the shooter is when the bolt actually physically comes to a stop at the back of the receiver. At that point, the momentum goes through into the shooter, and you can see the gun stays steady as the bolt's coming back, and when the bolt stops, then the gun rocks up, like so. The idea of constant recoil system is twofold. First off, there is no hard stop to the bolt. On a constant recoil system, the bolt is decelerated to the point that it actually stops physically before it hits the back of the receiver, and then is accelerated forward to do the other half of the loading process. The other half of constant recoil is balancing the momentum, or I know I'm going to get clobbered here for misusing the terms energy and momentum, but balancing the energy going forward with the energy coming backwards so that the gun stays stable. And virtually all of these are done with locked breech systems. Next up is a question from Jacob. It says, hi Ian, love the show. Over there in the US, firearms development seems to be thriving and producing effective and interesting designs. However, we Brits don't appear to be getting much done in the field recently, and when we do, it's not exactly fantastic quality, e.g. the L85A1. What's your take on why? Are firearms laws and public opinion making it harder for us to become good gunsmiths? Maybe something external I'm missing? I'd love to hear what you think on this issue. Well, Jacob, I think you pretty much nailed it right there. The UK has a remarkably anti-gun culture in general, even more so than much of the rest of Europe. When you make it that difficult to actually acquire and use firearms, and especially kind of have a cultural, the culture itself acts against firearms ownership in general, well, you discourage people in general from taking up the interest. And if you don't have interested people, that is a much smaller pool of folks who are going to turn to firearms design. The people who do have the sort of mechanical aptitude and interest will end up designing other mechanical things. There is currently, as far as I know, no large-scale military firearms manufacturing facility in England. The Enfield factory has been long shuttered. That's traditionally one of the places that really develops firearms designers as engineers, as professionals. If you don't have any place for people where they can work as firearms designers, and it's not really culturally acceptable for them to have firearms design or even firearms collecting or use as a hobby, it should come as no surprise that people are not generally going to get into firearms design. As a result, there aren't going to be a whole lot of innovative or very effective products coming out of the country. The UK is not alone in that. I think there's a lot of it other places in Europe, although many other European countries still do have firearms manufacturing facilities on relatively large scales. Germany, for example. France is in the same position. I think France had less of a firearms culture than England to begin with, but it's been squashed all the same. And the last French state arsenal, Saint-Étienne, turned into Giat, which is also long gone. And hence the French are now having to buy German firearms, just like you Brits are. Silver says, I would love to eventually acquire a primary rifle from each of the major world powers in World War II, with the Garand and K98s being particularly high on the list of rifles I would like to have. I have heard that both that single-rune K98s were assembled from spare parts, with non-matching serials right from the start, and conversely that they were purpose-built with matching serials. They were absolutely purpose-built with matching serial numbers. Basically, no country has ever deliberately produced non-matching guns, and definitely not the Germans. Any ideas on the production method? Are there any dead giveaways to keep an eye out for, or are frauds not encountered often enough to worry about? I'm honestly more interested in rifles that got bounced around after capture, as a well-traveled rifle just has more history in my opinion. Love the channel, thanks. Thank you. Are there any... Do you need to worry about fraud when attempting to buy a single-rune K98? Yes, absolutely. Single-rune guns are SS-issued guns. They are, my understanding is, they were manufactured from parts made in concentration camps. And as such, they have a substantial cult following, and they are extensively faked. To the point that I've looked at it and I've decided I do not have enough time in my life right now to learn the amount of detail necessary to properly identify a legitimate single-rune K98 from a fake one, and I just simply am not going to buy one because there are so many fakes and they are so good. This is particularly an issue with German guns, but particularly SS-issued guns and German sniper rifles as well. Fakes abound. Really good fakes abound because people are willing to pay an astronomical amount of money for some of this stuff, and that drives people to create really good fakes because there's not a whole lot of difference between, there's basically no mechanical difference between a standard Kar98K and a single-rune SS super collectible one. So definitely do your research, buy a lot of books, Make sure to find other collections, look at guns that you know to be fake, look at guns that you know to be real, as best you can tell, and do that for a long time before you start spending your own hard-earned money on something like a German sniper rifle or a Single-rune K98K. Good luck. Beyond that, I do tend to agree that weapons that have been captured and used by multiple parties, I think, are just an order of magnitude more interesting than very standard ones. Next up is from Tobias. What I would like to know is what the practical application for an LSW or SAW is, given that assault rifles can supply a lot of firepower just by themselves using full auto and 30-round magazines, yet weighing a lot less than a heavy-barreled LSW or something like an M249. Especially in recent years, I've been asking myself that a lot, given that modern medium machine guns, such as the recently adopted MG5, weigh only 4 pounds more than the MG4 in 5.56, use a lot of the same components, although they don't interchange because of different dimensions. Wouldn't it be more practical to get rid of that extra class of weapon and outfit everyone with 7.62 machine guns and simply use assault rifles with larger capacity magazines for the role of the LSW or SAW? There are two different things going on here. I would say let's start by considering that we have three types of weapons that you're talking about. One is the standard infantry rifle, which in modern form is selective fire and capable of full auto. We then have a squad automatic or light support weapon, which is generally going to be usually magazine fed, maybe belt fed, but it's going to be in the same cartridge as the infantry rifle. So in this case, we're talking about 5.56. And then you're going to have general purpose machine guns in typically 7.62 caliber that are heavier guns. And the question is, what are the applications of all three? In general, you don't really need all three of these things, although depending on your tactics and how a military wants to organize itself, you can. I would say, in general, you could definitely make the case to get rid of the LSW, the support weapon, the SAW, and replace it with a slightly up durability rifle. And in fact, the U.S. Marine Corps has done exactly that, or is doing that, with their M27 infantry automatic rifle. They are using that rifle to replace all of the SAWs, the M249s, in service with the Marine Corps. They are keeping 7.62 machine guns where those are applicable, which is the largely vehicular mounts. And yeah, they decided that there is sufficient firepower from the rifle. And in particular, what they found, the reason that they made this change is the rifle provided much more accurate firepower than the open bolt full auto only SAW. And when it came to suppression, they decided or concluded that a smaller amount of accurate fire provided better suppressing effect than a large volume of inaccurate fire. I can't comment on that study. Obviously I didn't take part in it, and I can't say I've ever been on the receiving end of enough gunfire to make a qualified opinion on the question, but that is the conclusion that the Marine Corps came to. As for what is the benefit of a SAW over a rifle, there is absolutely one, and it's the capability to deliver more sustained firepower. A rifle, if you dump a couple hundred rounds through a rifle, you have basically taken it to its limits, if we're talking about a very short period of time. The barrel weight on rifles, on an AR-15, things like the durability of the gas tube and its ability to dissipate heat, the handguards, their ability to dissipate heat. The rifle is just not designed to be able to dump a substantial amount of continuous firepower, and that's what the machine gun does. The machine gun is also designed primarily to be fired from a bipod. It provides a stable, accurate platform for firing more ammo at longer ranges than a rifle can do. And there really is a truly viable place for that weapon. That's not a bad idea. It's a really good idea. Now, the Marine Corps has decided that they don't actually need it, that they can tweak some of the other weapon platforms to make up for it. One might suggest that if the SAW had been a better gun than the M249, the Marine Corps might not have come to this opinion. The Singapore Ultimax, for example, has an excellent reputation and is an easier to shoot gun and probably more accurate than the SAW. That might have made a difference in this balance of opinions. Ultimately, a lot of different militaries choose differently. So we can look at a bunch of different examples and see how they turn out in the real world. Next question is from Hauke, I think. A repeat question from last time. were there last-ditch weapons developed in World War I? It seems that a lot of obsolescent weapons were brought back into service from all sides, but no designated, easy-to-manufacture designs were attempted. Why? Lack of aerial destruction of factories, or the concept of total war was not yet fully exploited, or is it just a misconception? Well, it is not a misconception. You're correct. There really were not last-ditch guns in World War I like there were in World War II, despite the fact that some of the conditions would really make you think that there should have been. The Germans did a few things to simplify production of the Gewehr 98, but not much, certainly when compared to World War II. The most substantial thing they did was to reduce the quality of the finish. Not the actual metal polish finish, but like the surface finish, the bluing, which that makes sense. I mean, obviously that's an easy thing to do, and it cuts a lot of time. It's really kind of surprising, in fact, that they didn't do more. The French never cut their standards at all on weapons manufactured during World War I. I don't have good information on exactly what the Russians are doing, but they didn't introduce any, like the Mosin emergency pattern Mosin Nagants. They didn't do any of that. Now, they were also out of the war a little bit earlier. I think the reasons why you pretty much guessed at quite effectively. There was not the strategic bombing of factories and destruction of factories the way that there was in World War II. You also didn't have a lot of factories being overrun. The front in World War I was more or less static through the entire war on the Western Front, and so factories didn't have to worry about having to move. It was just a matter of bringing in resources, and you don't even necessarily have to worry so much about things like your mines or your other natural resources being captured by the enemy, because on the Western Front at least there just wasn't a whole lot of that sort of movement. And in addition, I think the total war thing really wasn't in effect the way it was in World War II. So it's a very interesting point, though, because even with all of those factors, you would kind of think that standards, that people would realize we can drop our standards a bit, have a perfectly serviceable weapon, and make it more quickly and more easily and have more of them. So certainly all of these countries were producing small arms in staggering numbers right up to the end of the war. Germany in particular was producing them not just for itself but for other countries. And, the Germans were supporting the Austro-Hungarians. In fact, the French were supporting the Americans, not so much with rifles but with machine guns. So it is a curious question to bring up that a lot of people don't talk about. Next question is Gregoire, I think. I would like to have your opinion on the French 1873 revolver. It was adopted by the French Army as a cavalry trooper's handgun the same year as the U.S. Army got the Colt 1873, the Peacemaker. I have owned and used both, and I cannot imagine two guns that are more different, while still being revolvers with 6 rounds. They're both reliable and strong, but one's double action, one's single action. One has powerful ammunition, and the other not so much. So what do you think? And if in 1880 you found yourself in a fight on horseback, what would be your choice? I think my choice would be the 1873 French revolver. Naturally, I have one of them. And you're right, the downside to this thing is it actually is chambered for a pretty weak little cartridge. The 11mm French Ordnance revolver cartridge is a short little thing, and it is really underpowered. In fact, even compared to what this revolver can handle mechanically as it was built, the cartridge could have been stepped up quite a fair amount. The Colt, the single-action army from Colt, on the other hand, used a quite powerful cartridge. In fact, powerful enough that they ended up reducing it a little bit to make it easier to shoot. I think the reasons for that are that this thing was designed as a military handgun, where the Colt was almost designed more as a frontier gun. And one of the things directly in mind when they designed the Colt 1873 was shooting horses. You needed a handgun that would be effective on a horse. And for infantry combat, or even for cavalry troopers in Europe at that time, you weren't really worried about shooting the guy's horse out from under him so much. This was more about structured warfare, shooting at infantry. And frankly, they issued these things to officers as well. Officers didn't. It had been a very long time in Europe since officers had a serious handgun cartridge. They never really approached it in the way that the United States and the United Kingdom did. So a lot of European countries had relatively wimpy revolver cartridges for a long time. This is one of the examples. That said, it's a very nice handgun to shoot. Sights are reasonably good for the time period. It is still a gate-loading revolver like the Colt, which is still relatively slow to load. It does not have the ABID system, so with ABID, once you open the loading gate, you can then index the cylinder with the trigger. That doesn't happen on this. You just have to put the hammer at half cock and individually index through each cylinder to reload the thing like a Colt. But I like the idea of having a double action option, and I like these things. I do like the single action Army too, though. The grip on this fits me a little bit better. I think that pretty much covers that one, I think. And our last question is from Eric Meyer. What CNR bolt-action rifle would you recommend for someone who wants an occasional fun shooter but isn't interested in a Mauser? And I'm going to assume from your question that you're also not really interested in a Mauser derivative. Typically, my answer to this would be, well, the best bolt-action rifle of World War I, the U.S. model of 1917 Enfield rifle. But we'll assume you're not really interested in that either. And that's going to lead to a couple other options. You're going to have Mannlicher rifles, which are going to be things like Carcanos. We could say a French Lebel or Berthier. But again, those are clips can be difficult and expensive to find. Ammunition is difficult and sometimes, well, expensive and sometimes difficult to find. They're not the greatest shooters, let's be honest. If you want a fun occasional shooter in a milsurp rifle, I think there is one clear answer, and that is Switzerland. So this is a K11 carbine. I would say one of these, or a K31, or a Gewehr 96, or Gewehr 9611, or Gewehr 11. Or I'm sorry, a 9611 or an 11. The 96 is out, long story. One of these available, what are typically called Schmidt-Rubin rifles. They are excellent for accuracy. They tend to be in great shape because Switzerland never actually had to fight a war with them. They have this really cool and interesting and unusual straight pull action. The ammunition for them is at this current time still available. It's a little bit on the expensive side, or rather, it's typically priced ammunition. It's not cheap ammunition, but last I looked, it's 55 cents a round, give or take. And what's cool about it is it's Swiss surplus ammunition, which means it is fantastic quality, and it's kind of fun to look online at hand loading forums, and you don't really bother hand loading 7.5 Swiss because you can't really make it better than the Swiss surplus ammo without spending a huge amount of time, as opposed to most other cartridges where it's easy to make ammo that is more accurate, more repeatable and precise than the standard available surplus. So ammo's great. Clips are stupidly expensive for this, but you don't necessarily need them. You do have detachable box magazines for these rifles. You have a couple different options in length, the full-length rifle, the carbines. The K31 actually has a rear sight that goes all the way down to 100 meters, which is pretty cool. That means you can actually shoot it at a typical range without having to do the typical milsurp hold on, the base of the target sort of adjustment. The K11 here doesn't. This one goes down to 300 meters, but I kind of like the K11s. I think they have a smoother action. The K31, among other things, was designed to be a little more efficient to manufacture, and I don't think it's quite as nice of a system to cycle. So anyway, that is my recommendation. These are also, I should say, also still really quite available and relatively inexpensive. Something like $400 should be plenty to get you a pretty good Swiss straight pull rifle. That will change. Eventually, the supply of these things will dry up. Right now, they were imported in a couple batches, and then these things are still really available and pretty cheap in Switzerland. And so there are a lot of American importers that are buying them up from Switzerland cheap, bringing them over to the U.S. and selling them here. That's why the prices are held down at the $350, $400, maybe $450 range. Eventually, they're going to run out of these things in Switzerland to buy up cheap, and then prices here are going to start to go up. So if you are interested, this is still, you still have plenty of time to get one or a collection of Swiss straight pulls, and I don't think you'll regret it. So that covers the last of our 3 pages of Q&A questions for this month. thank you guys very much for watching. Thanks to everyone who submitted questions. As usual, as is now typical, I got way more questions than I could actually put into the video. So if you think you had a darn good question that you submitted, but I didn't include it here, please include it again next month. And I try to pay special attention to questions that are repeats. I don't have time to get everything, but I try to always address the really good questions that are in there. Thank you very much for watching.